As long as there have been armies, there has been the obvious need to get information to the soldiers as quickly and efficiently as possible. Long before radio and other electronics came along, the most efficient way to do this was by use of a bugle. Today in History Heights, we'll look at some of the ways that the United States military has used the bugle and listen to some historic examples as well. Let's get started. Greetings, everyone. I'm Gail Masenda with History Heights. Now, I played the trumpet from 7th grade through college and beyond in community bands and learned to play taps and other tunes, which are collectively called bugle calls. This was my very own trumpet, has been for many, many years. I could play bugle calls on my trumpet, but not all trumpet music can be played on a bugle. So, what's the difference between a trumpet and a bugle? The words trumpet and bugle are often used interchangeably, but that's not correct. They really are different instruments. There are multiple variations for each of them, but for our purposes, we're going to really simplify things and call this a trumpet and this a bugle. The modern trumpet looks much different from its ancestors. The very earliest trumpets were made from an animal horn or from a conch shell. Then came horns made from metals like copper or brass. In fact, the early trumpets, which are called natural trumpets, look a lot like the early bugles. The main differences are in the shape of the bell, the tube, which is called the bore, and the mouthpiece. Those differences resulted in the trumpet having a brighter, harsher sound, and the bugle with a slightly darker, more mellow sound. The same technique is used to play both a natural trumpet and a bugle, and each is capable of playing only specific notes. Here is how the 5 most common notes, which are also the easiest to play, are written in notation. And yes, my musician friends, for this video, I am intentionally bypassing all references to transposing instruments. Ancient trumpets were quite common and are mentioned many times in the Bible and other historic narratives and documents. Since they are loud, they were used to communicate over long distances and sent signals or commands to instruct people to what they were supposed to do, like advance or retreat, or to gather or break camp. In the days of the early North American colonies, both the colonists and the British Army used bugles to signal their troops. Soon after the American Revolution, Congress authorized a trumpeter as an official member of the military personnel. The primary bugler, trumpeter, was assigned to headquarters staff and stayed near the commander who gave the orders. The bugler's job was to relay those orders by playing the proper bugle call. In the early 1800s, keys, which look a lot like the keys on a saxophone, were added to these instruments, and a little later, rotary and piston valves were added to both bugles and trumpets. Both valves and keys altered the functioning length of the tubing so chromatic notes could be played. In other words, a musician could now play all the notes in between those 5 we talked about earlier, plus some above and below. This was a really big deal. The popularity of brass and community bands also led to the rise of the drum and bugle corps. Here's a bugle from my personal collection. It's about 100 years old, and it has a single piston valve. There. This is a standard military trumpet made somewhere between 1879 and 1891. It is made of brass, has a double coil, and has reinforcement around the end of the bell called a bell garland. This instrument was made to the specifications described in a document issued by the War Department Quartermaster General's Office. The document was titled Specifications for Trumpets and dated February 15th, 1879. It reads, for all foot troops to be the same as standard sample brass instrument in F, 2 coil with 2 mouthpieces. When complete, with mouthpiece in, to weigh about 12.5 ounces and to measure about 16 inches in length and about 4.5 inches in width at the center. Diameter of bell to be about 4.5 inches. And although there is much more to the story of these instruments, including many variations, today we have piston valves on the standard modern trumpet, like this, making it a much more versatile instrument than its basic valveless and keyless cousin, the bugle. Now, don't go thinking this was the end of the bugle. Bugles were still used by the United States military up through the Vietnam era. But today, when someone shows up to play a bugle call, like taps in a ceremonial setting, they usually do so on a modern trumpet. Now, before we go on to the historic recordings of the bugle calls, if you're enjoying this video, click that like button. And if you are a trumpet or a bugle player, or have a story about one, please let us know in the comments below. Okay, let's talk about the actual bugle calls. A bugle call is simply a short tune or a melody traditionally played on a bugle and is used as a military communication signal. The bugle calls, which were used by the American Army during the Revolutionary War, evolved from the ones used by the English and the French armies at that time. Bugles were used for communication in the cavalry and artillery, but drums filled that role for the infantry. It wasn't until the end of the Civil War that the cavalry, artillery, and infantry all used the bugle for communication. Even so, bugle calls were not yet standardized, and we can only imagine the confusion that caused. It wasn't until 1867, after the end of the Civil War, that the official calls were finally established and that are still in use today. Remember those 5 notes I showed you earlier? All of the official bugle calls are performed using just those 5 notes. Another instrument that is very similar to the trumpet is a cornet. And here's a cornet from my collection. You can see how similar it is to the trumpet that I showed you earlier. They both have piston valves, and the cornet is capable of playing the same notes the trumpet has. The primary difference is in the bore or the tubing. On trumpet, the bore is cylindrical for at least 2/3 of its length. And the cornet, by comparison, is like the bugle, which is a conical bore, which increases in size down the length of the tubing. This results in the cornet having a mellower sound that is actually closer to the bugle. Cornets were very popular in brass bands and community bands in the mid and late 1800s and well into the 1900s. So after all this discussion about trumpets and bugles, why am I bringing up cornets now? Well, it's because on September 5th, 1903, it was the cornet section of John Philip Sousa's band that made a recording on the Victor label for the Victor Talking Machine Company of Camden, New Jersey. The recording was made on a 12-inch disc and was simply named Army Bugle Calls, and it featured 13 selected bugle calls used by the United States Armed Forces. This is not all of the standard bugle calls, and on this recording, they're not quite presented in the order that they would typically be sounded during the day. Let's take a listen to them now.
First call. Reveille. Mess call. Guard mount. Adjutant's call. President's march. march. Sixth call. Assembly. Drill. Retreat. Tattoo. F.
Soldier didn't need a watch. His daily routine was announced by the bugler: when to get up, when to go to sleep, when to eat his meals, when to go see the doctor if he was feeling sick, when to go about his work or to assemble for a particular event, even when to feed and water his horse. And on Sundays, a church call was added to the daily schedule. From the instruments to the bugle calls and even to the ordering of the day, we can learn from the past, but we do not live there. Go be awesome today. Make your own history. Bye for now.